Welcome everyone to this year's 2023 San Mateo County Suicide Prevention Committee Messaging Matters webinar. Today is May 2nd, 2023, and please note that this meeting will be recorded. And let me, oh, sorry, advancing too quickly. Go back. Okay. And this is just a media notice to let you all know that this webinar is being recorded. The slides will be shared, the slides and recording will be shared to all registered participants, and this recording will be posted on our suicide prevention website and may be posted elsewhere within San Mateo County Communications. And I apologize, the chat is disabled, so originally we were going to give you the opportunity to introduce yourself in the chat, but we did get questions, but you can type in the Q&A section and feel free to introduce yourself if you'd like and ask any questions or provide any comments. You're also welcome to put anonymous questions and comments in the Q&A as well. But one question to start with, if you'd like to comment in the Q&A section, is what you'd like to get out of today's training, and feel free to type that in and I'll monitor the Q&A for Stan. And we have a favor to ask of you if you could help us complete this demographic survey. It helps us understand who we're reaching, who we want to reach further for these kind of webinars. And it also helps with our funding for these types of events to track our outreach. So I will put the link in the chat after I end these closing slides, and you can also scan the QR code. And we also want to acknowledge that a lot of this work and dedicate this work to people who we have lost to suicide, people who have attempted suicide or thought about suicide, and their loved ones. Many, if not all of us, know someone affected by suicide, and we want to honor our collective loss and your individual loss that you may have experienced, and any suffering that anyone has experienced due to suicide or suicidality. And we appreciate a lot of thoughtfulness, compassion, and action that is in this group. And I specifically also want to highlight, we have here on this slide words, artwork, photography from suicide attempt and loss survivors, and appreciate you all. And we have a land and labor acknowledgement, and I'm going to read it here. We acknowledge that we are each residing in tribal lands of those who have lived on this land from the time immemorial. We pay respects to their elders past and present. We recognize the resilience of those past and present who work to build a strong and sovereign nation where tribal members live their values and culture. We must acknowledge that much of what we know of this country today, including its culture, economic growth, and development throughout history and across time, has been possible by the labor of enslaved Africans and their descendants who have suffered the horror of transatlantic trafficking of their people, chattel slavery, and Jim Crow. We are indebted to their labor and their sacrifice, and we must acknowledge that the tremors of that violence throughout the generations and resulting impacts that can and still be felt and witnessed today. So we want to recognize our local indigenous community and the local Black African American community, ancestors to those who have been enslaved. Specifically for the indigenous community, we have 2 Ohlone tribes locally in San Mateo County. And if you happen to be elsewhere in the country, you can check out what local land you are residing in. And this slide is adapted from Trauma Transformed. And I put the link here for the local initiatives, the Native Indigenous Peoples Initiative, the African American Community Initiative, which specifically focus on behavioral health in these marginalized communities. And we also want to acknowledge that, and Stan may talk about this more, but this can be a heavy topic to talk about. So we really want to offer and share this resource with you all in case you need it or you know anyone who does need it. So if you know anyone who is in suicidal crisis or emotional distress, or maybe you want to talk to someone who, you want advice to help someone who is, you can call this 24/7 free confidential crisis support numbers. So there is our local Star Vista Crisis Center at 650-579-0350. If you call from a 650 number, you may be routed to them if you dial 988. Otherwise, 988 is the national suicide and crisis line nationally. You can also text BAY 741-741, which is a national crisis text line, or you can text 988 as well. And you can also visit our local crisis center's website, which is listed here, sanmatoecrisis.org, for teen crisis services and for all ages, actually. And for any emergencies that need immediate response, please call or text 911. And there's a resource here if you know anyone experiencing a mental health emergency. There's more specific guidelines. So let me check this next slide. If I think, yeah, I'll try to go through these quickly and then I'll pass it on to Stan. So we just wanted to share that this webinar is hosted by the San Mateo County Suicide Prevention Committee. You'll see some of us pictured here. If any of you are interested, we meet once a month, usually first Tuesdays of the month, 1:30 to 3 p.m. Currently, we're meeting virtually. And I co-chair this committee with Zena Andriani at Star Vista Crisis Center. So we welcome everyone, even if you don't feel like a suicide prevention expert, we welcome you all to join this committee for this collective cause to prevent suicide. And I'll be brief here, but we just wanted to share that our committee and our work, we are guided by this roadmap, this strategic plan that we have for a 5-year plan. And we wanted to share one part of it, which is goal 7, increase the use of best practices for reporting suicide and promote healthy use of social media and technology. So specifically, and it's specifically objective 7B, disseminate suicide safe reporting and messaging guidelines. So this webinar is really helping us advance this goal and this objective in our roadmap. And if you're curious to dig into it more, we will share our website as well. And I will stop there. We'll the rest of the slides we'll share during closing. And Stan, I'll pass it on to you.
All right, great. Excuse me. Thank you, Sylvia. Oh, and Sylvia, I just sent you a text and an email about getting an invite if you don't mind checking that out. But yeah, let me go ahead and pull up the slides. Sylvia, if you could just real quick confirm everything's looking good. You can hear me okay and all the things?
That looks great. Yeah, I see the full screen.
All right, wonderful. So good afternoon, everyone. My name is Stan Collins. I'm a suicide prevention specialist. I work on a variety of projects statewide, and I've worked in the field of suicide prevention now for, well over 20 years, I guess, almost 25 years. I got involved my senior year in high school, a couple years after losing a friend to suicide. So to Sylvia's point earlier about us being impacted by suicide, I identify as a lost survivor, someone's lived experience around the topic. And out of respect for everyone else who's been impacted, I will do my best to avoid any activating content during the course of the presentation. But there will be points when we're talking about means and methods a little bit that may be activating, especially. So I'll try to give another heads up, but just know that you're cared for, you're safe. And if you do need to, if it just gets to be too much and emotions rise to the surface and you need to take a break and come back, please do whatever you need to do to take care of yourself. But on that note, hopefully you're in the right place and you're going to hear about what you expected, which is we're going to talk about messaging as it relates to suicide prevention. So I'm going to provide some background, some examples, and my hope is that you're going to walk away feeling a lot more knowledgeable about the different components of messaging, but also that you'll feel a lot more empowered and comfortable to vet and to review and to create and craft messages that are related to suicide, whether you work say in the news media, or whether you're a school district putting out a newsletter or a business organization, whatever it may be. I hope you're going to walk away a lot more confident with that skill set. So on that note, let's start with a little bit of background and history. So both the national strategy and the state strategic plan for suicide prevention identify that we need to improve how we're messaging around suicide prevention. When I first got involved in suicide prevention back in the late 90s, at the time it felt like nobody was listening. And so we were, shouting from the rooftops, there's a fire over here, please bring water. And we were, using very dramatic statistics to really emphasize the issue. And we'll talk more of this as we go, but most people address and are aware that suicide is an issue in our communities across the nation. And so both of the strategies identify that we need to do a better job in crafting messages, creating messages, sharing information about proper messaging. And we'll talk some about the research that supports that. So, but just want to let you know, this isn't just something that you're doing. This is something we're doing statewide as well as nationally. So after the national strategy came out, there were a couple different, actually it was revised. So it came out, the initial version was in 2001, it was updated in 2012. And when the second version came out, it really kind of propelled things forward. And one of the activities they did is called Charting the Future. So they convened an expert panel to go out and look and analyze and evaluate the messaging that we were having around the nation on suicide and suicide prevention. Subsequently, the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention and the Action Alliance funded a Harris poll to go and look at how people were, what were their thoughts and feelings related to suicide. And as you see on the screen, most people believe that we should be doing more for suicide, that suicides can be prevented, that's important to invest. And so all this to say that while in, the beginning of my career, we were just trying to get people to pay attention and acknowledge that suicide is an issue. Now that most people acknowledge that it is an issue, if we only have a few precious moments of their attention, let's not spend it or waste it convincing them of something they already know. Let's show them what they can do about it. And so now when you look at a lot of the messaging, especially through the science campaign and other efforts, we're really focused on educating and giving people action and giving them direct access to resources as well. But that expert panel, when they went and they looked around, what they saw at the time was that there was all the emphasis was on the problem. And there was a lot of inflammatory language like suicides are epidemic and they're skyrocketing and identifying certain groups. But we were never really communicating, okay, well, what do you want us to do about it? We warn people in the news about, bad weather conditions or traffic conditions in the hope that people will take steps, but we have to give them those steps and really empower people to understand that they have a role to play in suicide prevention. What they also saw was there were too few stories of hope and resiliency. Most of the stories that were coming out were about, celebrity or high profile suicides, and very little about individuals who made it through a suicide attempt or had thoughts of suicide, but were diverted and got the help and support that they needed. Now, over the last decade or so, there's been a significant change. The lived experience community above and beyond the lost survivor community has really been shined a spotlight on. The attempt survivors have a stronger voice now than they've ever had, although we still need to do a lot of work. But one thing that I would really like to see more of is, again, stories of individuals who had thoughts of suicide and what diverted them, what helped them, what supports, what conversations with friends and family, what steps did they take or the people around them take, and really normalize those types of stories. And down at the bottom, this isn't so much an issue here in California because we have the statewide campaigns and tying into the local campaigns. But on the national level, they just identified there was no pink ribbon, there was no catchphrase or call to action. And unfortunately, the suicide prevention community nationally is still struggling with that. Now, this is a quote that came from that Charting the Future toolkit or report. And I think it speaks to a lot of the work that we've been doing over the last few years. While it's of course important for folks in suicide prevention and mental health to be sharing these messages, we really need to help every industry and every population, every culture understand that we all have a role to play. From the unemployment lines to Meals on Wheels to the animal shelters, everyone can be prepared to recognize those warning signs and to have a conversation about suicide. And that's really what we're trying to do. Now, the reason why this matters is because what the research shows us is that when we have negative messages about suicide, we'll have negative outcomes. And this is known as the Virtue effect. So the Virtue effect is a phrase that was coined in honor or in recognition of a book called The Sorrows of Young Virtue. It was published back in the 1800s, and the main character in it dies by suicide. And the historical accuracy of some of these accounts vary, but the short version of the story is that as this book circulated around Germany and then through the rest of Europe, there were multiple incidences of individuals who were, dying by suicide and had the book in their possession at the time of their death. Some individuals even dressed up like the character. And so in modern times, when a sociologist from UC San Diego was looking at this phenomenon, they coined it the virtue effect. So again, the virtue effect basically says when we have negative messages, we'll have negative outcomes. When we have messages that oversimplify or dramatize suicide, when we don't provide help-seeking information, when we give really detailed information on means and methods for unnecessary reasons, that can lead a vulnerable individual who's already having thoughts of suicide. It might remove a protective factor, move them a little bit closer to the edge. Now, it's not going to plant the seed or put the idea in somebody's head, but again, someone who's already having thoughts of suicide and is exposed to that message. So in the first half of my career, I spent a lot of time working with this, at the time, especially news media, saying, don't do this. If you do this, not to be overly dramatic, but if you do this, somebody might die. And, over the time, a phenomenal individual, his name is Thomas Niedenkrollenthaler out of the University of Vienna. The last few years, he's really emphasized the other side of the coin, which is known as the Papageno effect. And the Papageno effect basically says when we have positive messages, we will have positive outcomes. When we don't normalize statistics that are dramatic about suicide, when we don't give overly unnecessary detailed descriptions of means and methods, when we have a more prevention-focused or help-seeking focused framework, that we can actually get people to help. So anytime we talk about suicide, of course, we want to include the National Lifeline or local crisis line, crisis text line. And so, again, it's kind of two halves of the coin. So virtue effect, to summarize again, is negative messages can lead to negative outcomes. Papageno effect, on the flip side of that, says that if we have positive messages, we can lead to positive outcomes. And this is all centered around the framework for successful messaging, which is created by the Action Alliance, who are the entity behind the national strategy. They created a website, you see it there on the screen, suicidepreventionmessaging.org. I would encourage you to spend a little bit of time there, especially down the road as you're crafting messages or reviewing messages. It gives you a lot of different aspects of it. We're going to do our best to summarize it as well as we can today, though. So again, just to summarize, some of the consequences we're trying to avoid with the messaging, we're trying to avoid and minimize imitative behavior or reinforcing negative stereotypes. Instead, we're trying to raise awareness, educate folks, give them resources, and encourage them to action and have a conversation if they're worried about somebody or if they themselves are having thoughts of suicide, to reach out for help. So the framework that I mentioned, the safe and effective messaging framework for suicide prevention, as you see, it's wrapped around with strategy. And we're going to talk first about strategy, but it also includes things to consider regarding safety. What are some of the things we can try to avoid? We'll also discuss some of the guidelines that are out there. The good news is we're not flying in the dark anymore, that there's a lot of content out there to help guide and craft our messages. And also some steps that we can take to include a positive message and really focus on prevention. If we're going to talk about suicide prevention, we got to get people to understand, first and foremost, we got to start with suicide can be prevented. Does that mean it can always be prevented? No, not necessarily. But that has to be our goal. That's the ideal that we're striving for. So when it comes to the first step, it should always be strategy. And a lot of times, whether I'm working with a school district, a behavioral health organization, or what have you, one of the first things that they always want to jump to is, well, we need a poster, or we need a brochure. And before we're even getting to that space, why do we need a poster? What poster should we use? What is the message that we want? How does this fit into our overall strategy? If you're going to put out posters that say suicide is preventable, talk to your doctor, have you given the physicians in your community a heads up that these posters are going to be putting out? Have you trained said doctors on screening and on the supports that they have available? So we need to understand and define the why before we even get to the how. So before we just go and print or buy posters, let's look at where we're at. So again, pulling these from other public health messaging frameworks, setting the context. Why are we using this message? Who are we trying to influence? What do we want them to do? What do we want them to say? And then we figure out, okay, then this is the materials that we need. Now, fortunately, through Know the Signs and a variety of other efforts, there's some really good materials out there to speak to diverse populations and across various needs. But before you decide on which one, let's make sure it fits into our overall strategy. All right, so now we're going to mostly focus on emphasizing safety. And this is a quote from the AP, or the Associated Press's Vice President for Standards. And what they're talking about here, I won't read the full quote, but basically what he's trying to address is saying that suicide, from what we see from the research, is one of those areas where maybe news media doesn't need to provide all the information. Maybe there are certain details that aren't necessarily for the public good, and in fact, may actually do public damage. Do individuals need to know that someone died? Maybe, maybe not. Do they need to know their cause of death? Maybe, maybe not. I would suggest that it's only in rare circumstances where talking about a specific mean or method or getting into some of the gruesome details, are valuable for the public good. One instance, especially that was, very unfortunate, was when Robin Williams died by suicide. There was overly detailed descriptions of the manner of his death. And I know it was traumatic for me as an individual. And unfortunately, that came directly from the medical examiner at the time. So it wasn't so much the news media. It was actually the responders to that. And while the excuse was used, oh, well, it's public information, we had to share it. A lot of those details were given out during a very nationally or probably worldwide published or publicized press conference. Maybe those details didn't need to be included, when we're speaking to a microphone when the world is listening. Maybe we could give an overview and give those details out in a later way, or maybe just in writing. So I'm not trying to hide the information or stigmatize suicide by talking about it, but sometimes less can be more. Now, before we go any further, I'm sure many of you are aware of this by now. It's becoming more and more common, but there is recommended terminology that we have out there in the field of suicide prevention for describing actions related to suicide. When someone has died by suicide in the past, the most common term that we would use is this person died by, committed suicide. And I know we don't have the chat feature working, and I won't clog up the Q&A, but otherwise I would have done a little, word association game with you. And, I'd have asked, okay, well, I want you to fill in the blank. What are some of the actions that we commit? We commit blank. We commit blank. And you probably would have said crime and sin and treason and adultery and fraud. And unfortunately, the term committed is very tied to issues of crime or sin. A lot of people are shocked to find out it used to be illegal to attempt suicide in California. A lot of faith institutions have in the past framed suicide as a sin or the equivalent of a sin. Now, fortunately, faith institutions are starting to look at that and reevaluate. For example, the Jesuit Order of the Catholic Church a few years back declassified suicide as a mortal sin because they realized that framing suicide as a sin wasn't preventing people from dying by suicide, it was preventing people from asking for help. So we want to attempt to break that connection of committed to crime and sin when it comes to suicide. Instead, we want to use the terms died by suicide, died of suicide, even took their own life. Now, the reality is of course, we commit to a lot of positive things, right? We commit to our friendships, our relationships. You committed to be here at this training. But that term committed, it carries, again, that stigma, that bias with crime and sin. Another area that we're trying to change the language around is when it comes to attempts. You'll oftentimes hear people refer to successful attempts or unsuccessful or failed attempts or even completed attempts. And the truth is there's no failure or success when we're talking about suicide. So these should be either referred to as a death by suicide or an attempted suicide. To be clear, we're not trying to hide what happened. We're not trying to stigmatize conversations about suicide. Again, we're just trying to break that association of crime and sin. Now, a lot of times people ask, well, what's the data to show us that using this terminology works? And the reality is there was one study that was done, and they went and spoke to people with lived experience, loss survivors, attempt survivors, people that experienced ideation. And these were the recommended terms that either just attempted, died by, died of, or took their own life were the recommended terms. And I think when we're working with any group, any population, if there's recommended terminology that comes with respect, then we try our best to do that. Now, this is the first time you're hearing about it. It's going to take your brain a few, dozen times before it makes the switch. And I also want to, offer that if you hear someone use the non-recommended terminology, please don't attack them. Please use it as a teachable moment. But I think the more that we can get on the same page with our language, it can help us to have more critical and valuable conversations about this. Right. So as I mentioned earlier, regarding the Virtue effect, a short version or short definition, again, is just unsafe messages can influence vulnerable individuals. And it's not going to plant the seed, put the idea in their head, But oftentimes when there's news reports of a potential suicide incident on a bridge or a height, oftentimes in the following days in that geographic area, we will see repeats of that incident. So it can, again, be that little bit of nudge or make someone, we use the term capable a lot in suicide prevention. So by hearing these stories, by being exposed to unsafe stories, someone may have protective factors removed and they may become more capable of following through with the suicide attempt. So we want to filter any message that we put out or share through that filter or that lens of safety. All right, now, even if we have the most positive story, we're talking about a suicide prevention walk, we're talking about resources, we're talking about a new crisis stabilization unit that's being put into the community. We always want to also provide people with a resource. Again, anytime we're exposed to messages about suicide, it can raise emotions to the surface. So we want to let people know, and I apologize, I put the wrong image for your local hotline. I know we shared it earlier, but 988 or the National Lifeline crisis text line. Now, the one thing I want to emphasize when it comes to these resources is it's not just it's great. It's one thing to in the ticker box or the call out box or at the bottom of the story. And we see this more and more frequently. I think, and just I'd say about 90% of the time when I read an online article, the lifeline is there somewhere in the article. But I would venture to say that it's important for us to go above and beyond that, because some people still have fears or barriers about reaching out to one of these resources. They might think that they're being a burden. They might think that they're taking someone else's place in line. A lot of folks still believe that you have to be in crisis before you should reach out. And we really want to encourage folks to reach out before the crisis. If they're worried about a friend and they need some coaching up before they talk to that person. If they talk to the person, now they're not sure where to go. If even for you today, if emotions rise to the surface because of this training, you can call the lifeline and just kind of process those emotions. So we really need to start getting rid of the barriers for folks to be reaching out to these resources. So when it comes to, how we utilize data, again, instead of utilizing data to show just, the impact of suicide deaths, what if we, instead of normalizing suicide, we took that opportunity to normalize help seeking? So rather than saying, hey, last year, did you know that, nearly 50,000 people died by suicide? What if we say, hey, did you know that last year over 300,000 people decided to find their reasons for living by contacting the lifeline? And now again, we're normalizing that help seeking. We're, instead of making people more capable for suicide, we're making people more capable to seek out and get the help that they need and that they deserve. So here again, we're normalizing that help seeking while also promoting a resource. I mentioned earlier about statements that we were in the past, in the beginning, using things like you see on the screen. Every 40 seconds, somebody in the world dies, or every, so and so minutes, somebody attempts. And when you really break these down, they're not actual statistics, right? People don't die on a set time. You don't have to sign up for a slot. It's not scheduled. What somebody did is they took the number of suicides across the world every year and they divided it by the number of seconds. And they came up with this, statistic. But really what it is a statistic that has been altered to be more dramatic. The numbers around suicide are already plenty dramatic. The number of people who die, the number of individuals who attempt, it's estimated that over 10 million people in America this year will consider suicide. Those are dramatic enough. And again, people already understand that suicide's an issue. We don't need to manipulate data or share data or even share verbiage like skyrocketing, epidemic. The reality is, for many communities over the last couple of years, we've actually seen a decrease in suicide overall. That fluctuates when you look at different populations. We know that young Black males have had a pretty significant increase in suicides over the last couple of years. But we just want to be very careful with our data. And we'll talk more about population-specific data sharing here in just a little bit. All right, again, I know we only have the Q&A enabled, but I'm hoping that you could utilize the Q&A to engage with me. So looking at just going off what we know so far, what are some of your thoughts about the image that you see, the 22 veterans commit suicide every day? So if you could just drop some of your thoughts in the Q&A. Again, I know it's not ideal. I apologize. Thanks for being flexible with us.
Sorry to interrupt.
Go ahead.
I think I may have activated the chat, so maybe folks can use it. I'm not sure.
Oh,
yeah.
Perfect.
Okay, great.
All right, fantastic. Perfect timing, Sylvia. Thank you. And I learned something new. I didn't know you could do that mid-session. I do want to give a shout out to Priscilla or Lana Jean. Asked if you can get the slides. See, I think we were going to put the recording out, but I'm happy to share the PDF of the slides. I just ask that you don't go freelance. And if you do use any of the materials, if you could just give a little citation or recognition, they'd be appreciated. But as far as I'm concerned, for the most part, plagiarism is encouraged when it comes to suicide prevention. So, all right. So looking at the chat, so the terminology, use of the word commit. So they're using stigmatizing language. And, so there's a normalization effect with that, again, going on the data, we're normalizing suicide. Now, one of the things just to note when it comes to suicide prevention in general, we try to avoid the color red. This one is unique is because obviously it's got the American flag. So they're, going off the color scheme. But a couple of things that when I look at this, there's actually really good feedback there. It's sorrowful. It makes me want to ask why. It's just kind of negative. Now, some would argue that it's been a call to action for folks to, push for more funding for the VA and better resources for our veterans, and all that's tremendous. But what if I'm the veteran who's having thoughts of suicide and I walk down the hallway and I see a poster that says, hey, 22 people who are just like you are going to die today? Might that inadvertently remove a protective factor? Might that normalize suicide and make me think, well, if not me, if it's not somebody else, it might as well be me. Again, it oversimplifies the causes. It can also stigmatize veterans. There's a lot out there that, we have to push back against this notion that every veteran is dealing with PTSD and needs mental health services. So it also further stigmatizes populations. And again, we'll talk more about some population specific stuff, but thanks for everybody. We're going to do this a few more times. So thanks for everybody for being so engaged in the chat. That's great. So again, to summarize, it's got an undefined audience. Who are we trying to communicate this to? Now, if I'm going to the board of supervisors for funding, that's one thing. But if I'm putting this poster out in public, knowing that veterans will be exposed to it, that's where therein lies the danger. There's also no call to action. Okay, so veterans are dying by suicide. What do you want me to do about it? And just the languages we talked about previously. All right, so let's do another one. So I know this one's probably a little bit hard to read. The font is small. I try to make it as big as I could. But looking at this one, what are some of the potential flaws that you see with this image? All right, so language. Yeah, font looks like a horror movie. It's kind of, again, utilizing that red. It's got a creepy vibe to it. The use of the stats. There's not a single resource. Yeah, and someone pointed out too, not everyone is of Christian faith. So utilization of crosses is dramatic, B, not very appropriate or respectful. It's punitive. So yeah, there's a lot of things not to like about this one. So again, focus on the severity, absolutely nothing on prevention, no call to action. We talked about it, dark images, dark colors. Also, again, the use of kind of just using, one faith is not inclusive, the language and the use of data. So a lot of things. And then someone else mentioned, yeah, it's just kind of overwhelming. So again, those are just some examples of the things that we want to try to avoid. So I've kind of hinted at this a few times, and this one is a little bit more complex. I do a lot of work around means safety or restricting access to lethal means. And this one is a little bit tougher because there are times where it is necessary to talk about means and methods. For example, I'm sure many of you are aware that there's construction and netting on the Golden Gate Bridge. But for them to get the public awareness, to get the funding and get the support for them to get that netting, they had to raise awareness about the issue. Now, by doing so, at the same time, it could inadvertently increase risk for individuals who may be thinking about suicide, who live in the area and may be exposed to that image. So sometimes it's not as simple as don't talk about it. Sometimes there really is a public good and a public need to have these types of conversations. But do we need to be overly dramatic with it? Or what considerations can we give? So in general, though, unless it's pertinent to the story and to a prevention effort, in most cases, I would suggest that it's reasonable to avoid talking about means and methods. For example, going to celebrity suicides. We talked about, Robin Williams' death was very graphically shared. Whereas Anthony Bourdain, who many people were equally as heartbroken over, very limited details. Now, part of that is because it occurred in, my understanding is in France. And so there may be different media parameters or, jurisdictional things that can occur. But instead of reading the headline like you see here, it was Anthony Bourdain. And I believe I have an image that will show you. Now, there was a case, I'm from San Diego, and there was a case of a NFL football player, Junior Seau, who died by suicide. And I apologize. This is, again, the conversations about methods and means can be somewhat activating. So if you need to take a break for a minute or two, that's totally fine. But when he died by suicide, he used a firearm. Now, that wasn't necessarily significant, but what was significant was the location of the injury. He did not shoot himself in a manner that would injure his brain, because he was pretty confident that he had some traumatic brain injury and he wanted his brain to be studied. So in the news reports that came out, it was important for folks to know to some degree, or it could be argued that it was for the public good for people to know that he had intentionally done it in that manner. Now, does that mean that they needed to know that it was a firearm? Maybe, maybe not. I would suggest that they certainly didn't need to know what type of firearm or the exact location of the injury. Similar to what I said, injured in a way that preserved the brain would have been enough information. And so, again, sometimes there are considerations as to why this would be important, or when we want to talk about means and methods. And everything we're talking about, all these safety filters that we're addressing, these are not hard, fast rules. These are considerations. These are guidelines. And all that we really, truly ask is that when you're creating, crafting, sharing messages, that you at least give some consideration to the potential ramifications. Just in general, a lot of times people ask, well, when is it significant to report on someone's suicide death? And my response, my general guideline is, well, would you be reporting on this person's death if it hadn't been by suicide? If it's the city's mayor, yeah, it probably would have been reported on anyways. If it was just a citizen down the street, probably not. So sometimes looking and just going back to square one and being like, why are we even covering this in the first place? So let's look at this one. If you could go ahead and get in the chat again and let me know what you like, what you don't like. Do you think this one's good? Do you think this one's bad? What are some of your thoughts on this example? All right, so lots of stats. No real resource. No call to action. So there are some things there that could be good for discussion or informative. So there are some actual fairly, valuable statements in there. But again, who is our audience? So some people like the format of it. It's at least, the color schemes aren't quite as bad. But the imagery, do we need to include a picture of a gun? Do we need a picture, the skull and crossbone while, kind of the international sign for poison, also a little bit dark, so maybe didn't need to be used there. It's a little bit shocking. The language, I'm not sure if anybody kind of picked up on this, but the price of suicide, somewhat sounds, I think William, you saw that. So, the cost, or a lot of times we use the language, the burden of suicide. So we just want to be very careful about the verbiage that we use. So while there is some actual solid information in this, the way it's portrayed, the way it's shared, especially in light of the fact that there's no call to action, there is no resource. I would say this one definitely could have used some improvement. Also, when it comes back to means and methods, unless we're speaking to a group that can do something about reducing access to lethal means, or we're really emphasizing action. Okay, so because of these stats, this is the action we want you to take in your home to safeguard against suicide. Prescription takebacks, firearm partnerships to store firearms out of the home. So let's give them an action. And also, someone pointed out again, we always need to do a better job at being more inclusive. across as many cultures and gender identities, sexual orientations as we can. So again, you're spot on with a lot of your feedback, images and means and methods, a lot of focus on severity, not much of a prevention message, a lot of negative language. And while there is some, reasonable information, what are we trying to do here? All right, so let's switch gears. I want to do another activity with you. So what causes suicide? If you can just type it in the chat, what are some of the things that cause suicide? Hopelessness, loss of hope, severe depression, situations, co-depressions, unending suffering, trauma, loneliness, PTSD, trauma. A lot of times people say breakups of romance, divorces, losing a loved one. A lot of times we go to the circumstances. I would say probably the one, all of these are correct to some degree, and yet at the same time, none of these are spot on, right? Because one thing doesn't cause suicide every time, right? If I let go of this pen, what will it cause it to do? It's going to cause it to fall, right? So by using the term cause, that means that it's the only inevitable outcome. When I let go of that pen, it will fall, right? But when we say, even as close as hopelessness is to, being at the root cause of suicide, there's a lot of people who experience hopelessness that will never think about suicide. There's many people who will go through housing issues, monetary issues, food issues, mental illness, depression, breakups, bullying, trauma, PTSD, who will not think about suicide. And this is important because all of these, and I absolutely agree, Lana Jean, that intergenerational trauma is real, but again, it doesn't cause suicide. If any of these things cause, and that meant that every person who experienced that would automatically think about suicide. And that's a very kind of hopeless message to share to people. There's plenty of, about a decade ago, the term was really popular, bullycide. And so you saw posters all over schools that said bullycide, prevent bullying, or you'll cause suicide. And what that inadvertently was doing was it was normalizing suicide as a response to a fairly common and unfortunate life circumstance of bullying. But similar to being a veteran doesn't cause suicide or trauma of any type. So we want to let folks know that, yes, while many people who experience the circumstances that you all just mentioned will experience thoughts of suicide, it's not an if this, then that type of thing. And so I have the image there of the board game Jenga. Probably familiar with it. You stack up blocks. You go around the table and you take turns pulling out the blocks, and eventually somebody's going to pull out the block that causes the whole tower to fall apart. And we say, oh, well, you lose because that one block caused everything to fall apart. Now, in reality, we know that it wasn't that one block, right? It was all those pieces that had been pulled out. Now, if we use this as a metaphor for suicide, what we often refer to as the straw that broke the camel's back, that why. I remember when my buddy died, I really wanted to know the why. What was that one thing? And we do know that there's typically a precipitating event, but it wasn't that one piece. If all those other pieces had been in place, that one thing probably would not have caused everything, the whole tower, to fall apart. And so if we kind of continue on this metaphor, we can't necessarily, we need to do a better job preventing the negative things that you mentioned and the negative outcomes. But we can't always in the moment prevent those bad things from happening. What we can do is to teach people to be vigilant, to trust their instincts, to stay connected. And when they see blocks getting pulled out of a person's life, to come in and help reinforce that structure, to put some scaffolding in there, to put some help seeking, some coping skills, to share some resources, to check in and to show up. So hopefully that next block doesn't cause everything to fall apart. And so when we're messaging about suicide, we want to be very careful in this space as well. So we want to avoid oversimplifying the causes of suicide and not framing suicide as if this, then that, because again, it can make people think that suicide is a common response to fairly, or the automatic response to fairly common life circumstances. So we want to say that suicide is complex. We want to show that it's interconnected. It's all those things, right? All those things and how they fit in together. I remember when I first got involved in suicide prevention, we said, like what you see at the bottom, 90% of people who die by suicide had a diagnosable psychiatric or disorder or mental illness. while many people who experience thoughts of suicide do deal with a lack of mental wellness or mental health issues or specifically mental illnesses, not everybody does. And the CDC report that came out a few years ago said it's probably more around 50%. But also, if only it were that simple, right? Because if 90% of people who die by suicide have a mental illness, then all we need to do is fix mental health and then suicide will go away. But some people will never go seek help for therapy. So we got to employ other strategies and avoid oversimplifying these causes for suicide. So when we talk about, the causes, we just have to be very careful to show that, just looking at some of the chat, you guys are really engaged. This is already, all of you are just really engaged. This is really cool. And also, yeah, the why can contribute to shame and trauma, especially if there was a relational issue that had recently occurred. And then one of the, Lana Jean, I'm going to just jump on your comment. There are lots of pressure on kids to succeed. That's one thing I really emphasize when I'm working with school staff is it can be the kid that's sitting alone at lunch and can be isolated. But I would say in my personal experience, anecdotally, probably 25 to 50% of the suicides I've been exposed to were youth who were very high achieving and almost had a perfectionist mentality to it. I remember a few years back, there was a detective that contacted me. A young girl had died by suicide, a 13-year-old. And the detective called me, and as I was talking to the detective, she said, "Stan, I just don't get this. One's kicking me in the gut. I just don't get it." This young girl was, an ASB. She was first chair in the orchestra. She was really athletic. She was really charming. She was beautiful. She was well-liked. She was everything to everyone. And I just said, "Detective, you just answered your own question. A 13-year-old, student a youth shouldn't have to feel the pressure to be everything to everyone." So again, we got to just understand that there's a lot of complex ways that people can end up with these thoughts and avoid that oversimplification. Going back to a specific population, I wanted to share this resource with you, talking about LGBT and suicide. Now, apologies, this was created, a lot of the organizations that support LGBTQ plus were part of this toolkit. At the time, though, most of the data wasn't inclusive, so it really was focused on LGBT before we expanded our perspective. So just want to acknowledge that. But in it, a lot of times we'll hear statements like, well, LGBTQ plus youth are 3 to 4 times more likely to attempt suicide. And again, that goes back to those stats that we were talking about and population specific stats. Now, again, if I'm going to the school board to get more funding to support my LGBTQ plus kiddos, then yeah, I might use a statement like that. But I would never say that out loud in a room full of youth, knowing that inevitably some of the youth in that room will identify as LGBTQ plus. And no one wants to be told because of one part of who you are, because of one part of your story, that you're automatically inherently going to be more at risk for suicide. And the quote that you see on the screen, what they kind of extrapolated was that there's nothing about being LGBT that increases automatically risk of suicide. And if you read on, it says it's the social prejudices that are attached to gender identity or minority sexual orientation. So these can include discrimination, family rejection, but it is those negative outcomes rather than the minority sexual orientation or gender identity per se that are the risk factors. So it's not being LGBTQ plus, it is the negative external factors that can come in. So it's not what's wrong with that individual, it is what's going on and what's wrong with the supports in the society around them. So this is just one example. This could be replicated across populations, across cultures, but I just wanted to share with you as one example. Again, we got to be very cautious when we're messaging. And the most important question to ask when you're putting out a message is, okay, well, who is our audience? And again, if you have veterans that are going to be in the crowd, if you are speaking to any group and you know that LGBTQ plus are going to be in the room, or you're going to speak about young Latinas, you just want to be careful about what is the purpose of the message that you're trying to share. All right, so let's look at another one. So this one speaks to LGBTQ plus. Looking at this poster or this infographic, what are some of the things you like or don't like on this one? And Sylvia, just checking in, I saw that you went back to Priscilla to see if her the question was answered. And I'm just wondering which question that was. If you can either message me or unmute really quick, I want to make sure I do my best to answer all of them.
Oh, yes, Stan, thank you. So just to read, the comment was about 10 years ago, many high school students took their own lives. It was Palo Alto, I think. Wonder what you think was the cause.
So for that one, again, I don't think it was a single cause. I think it was a very high stress community with a lot of those pressures to perform. But there was definitely a contagion factor. Suicide cluster is what we refer to it as when we have multiple suicides in a geographic area. So there was a lot. So there was a lot of things, obviously, right? It wasn't just one thing. There was a high stress environment. Who knows what the personal situations with all these youth was, but I think one of the things that kind of made it overflow was a lot of the negative messaging in the media. And again, when you're every day, you're being bombarded with stories of suicide while you're actively having thoughts of suicide, it can remove those protective factors and it can make you see to be more capable. It's kind of the inverse, if this makes sense. When we see people in high level positions, whether it's the individual winning the Oscar or whether it's the president, when we see people that look like us and sound like us being capable of doing these things, whether those are positive things and goals to achieve or whether they're suicide, we become more capable and we can see ourselves. And once we can start to see ourselves, I know that's kind of a twisted metaphor and an analogy, but it's kind of a similar mentality, and that's why that contagion, it makes it more capable, makes it to some degree more acceptable. So I hope that somewhat answers it. Let's see, I'm going to scroll back up. So there's some heavy text. There's some negative messaging in bold. Some people are liking the color scheme. Some are more just kind of design things. I mean, in general, I think, a lot of the imagery is at least, a little bit brighter. Transphobia Kills sounds like the title of a horror film. That's actually fairly accurate. I hadn't heard that one before. Someone did point out, though, that there is some positive stuff, that supportive environments are key to mental health. So it's not just negative. It's not just saying, this group is impacted, but they are giving them some positive information. Still kind of a limited on resources, though. So there's, there again, who's the audience? What's, as powerful as some of this information is, and even though some of it is accurate, again, what are we trying to accomplish? So it does highlight protective factors, supportive environments, family support, as well as acknowledging some of the risk factors, but there is a really heavy focus on the severity, a little bit of the misuse of the data. Some of it's a little bit, convoluted, but, multiple times they talk about, what are some of the things that can push back against the increased risk with this? A really good feedback in the chat. I'm sorry, I'm not able to get to all these. So when we take a sec, I'll try to read through some of these, but really good feedback and examples. So this one, obviously I'm biased. And this is just one example. Through Know the Signs, we have culturally adapted materials that try to focus on a variety of different groups to be as inclusive as we can. But we always try to include a resource. The sample from the campaign is Know the Signs, find the words, reach out, give them the action steps. We always include the National Lifeline. We try to educate folks on warning signs. So again, I'm not saying this one is perfect, but at least we're focusing on resources, action, and again, through the various iterations of that poster, trying to be as inclusive as possible. All right, so I'm going to pause for a second, and Sylvia, I'm just going to ask, I know there's some statements or questions. I'm trying to sift through everything. I just want to see if there's anything that you want to highlight or point out.
Yeah, I can read some. I'm sorry. I hope I'm not sure if you answered these already, but one question was, what can we say to make it easier to get people to take the step to get the help? And I can read the whole comment. It says, I have noticed that it can be hard to get some people to get mental health support because of the cultural beliefs that you don't go talk about your problems outside of your home. So how can how can you help people get that help if they already have it in their minds? If minds, it's not okay. That makes it harder to prevent things like attempted suicide. What can we say to make it easier to get people to take that step to get the help?
Wow, it's a great question, a powerful question. I can only do my best to answer part of it because obviously I don't have all the answers, but I think part of it is continuing to normalize conversations across cultures, across populations. I'm going to share with you later a program I work on called the Directing Change Program, where I helped to co-found it, and we invite youth to create films about mental health and suicide prevention. We have a category called Through the Lens of Culture. And one of the films that won this year is just phenomenal in how it addresses it's two young individuals who identify as Latino, and they're talking about, I tried to reach out to my mom, but they said, they downplayed it. And so I reached out to my friend. So I think part of it is going to be generational. When I work with the youth, I think they have a lot higher hopes for what mental health can look like among cultures. But I don't know, that one's pretty complex. I think a lot of populations, ethnicities, cultures, groups have stigma related to mental health and stigma related to suicide. So I think looking at your resources through Take Action, through Know the Signs, we have a variety of culturally adapted materials, not just translated, but some of those might be effective. We have mental health guides across populations and such. But I just hope that soon we'll get to a place where we can understand that culture is not just a bad thing for mental health. There's a lot of good things that happen in culture: connectedness, familial support, maybe family, or faith. So there's a lot of things that culture can do to help. So I could probably go on all day. So I'm just going to stop there. So I'm sorry I can't answer that perfectly, but great question for discussion. So another question comes from a loss survivor type mentality. Means used by someone close to me to die by suicide. One of the questions that I really, hated getting when I would talk about my friend was, well, how did they do it? And, because it immediately, even though I wasn't at the scene, I heard about it, unfortunately. And so every time someone would ask me, that image would pop in my head. How did they do it? And so I finally, just got to a place where I said, how they did it is less important than the fact that they couldn't find reasons for living. But, just as a cultural competency thing for anybody out there, it's really an inappropriate question to ask somebody if they have been, experienced a loss by suicide, unless, again, it's in the course of a conversation where you are sharing the means and methods because you want to help reduce access in the future to folks. What I always tell people is when somebody dies by suicide and they hear that, oh, what happened to your brother? Oh, he died by suicide. Instead of asking how they did it, because again, it really doesn't matter, ask them what their name was, ask them what they were like, ask them what their favorite song was, what movies did they like, what was the time they made you laugh, what was one of the favorite trips that you took with them? Because unfortunately, when we lose somebody to suicide, the manner of their death becomes the summation of their life a lot of the times. They had a full life up until those final moments. And so giving people an opportunity to share stories about the life can be really healing and positive for folks. So that would be my recommendation. Otherwise, again, if people do ask you, it sounds like you're asking, if people ask me, what do I say? That's kind of my blanket response. How they did it is less important than the fact that they didn't want to be here. So I hope that is some consolation to you for that question. All right, well, let's move on. Let's switch gears and talk about.
Sorry to interrupt, Stan. There's one more question in the Q&A section.
Oh, yeah, I'm sorry.
Can you share why you don't use RED with suicide, and what are your thoughts on QPR and Be Sensitive, Be Brave trainings?
Again, apologies if this is activating. Just in general with suicide, use of the color red, it's just got an association with blood. So it's not saying that you can't use red ever, but in general, the suicide prevention field just kind of tries to avoid it just the brains make associations that aren't necessarily there, but that would be why. As far as the other trainings, QPR is a solid training. I'm a master trainer in QPR. They've done a lot of good. What was the other one? It's Dr. Joyce Chu's training. The Be Brave. Be Brave. Mm-hmm. Yeah, Be Sensitive, Be Brave. I think that's a phenomenal training. I think Dr. Joyce Chu does tremendous work. But I don't think any one training is necessarily, better than the other. It's what are the needs that you're trying to accomplish. I think there are some suicide prevention programs out there that are doing tremendous work. I think there's also a lot that, even though they did a lot of good work, they're getting a little bit outdated. I think that's one of the problems that we have when we're looking at like evidence-based programs. It takes a lot of time to get evidence-based. But once you're evidence-based, you're probably already out of date, because the field and our society is moving so swiftly. So I don't think I want to give my opinion about which one is better than the other. I would just say, again, go back to that idea of strategy. What are you trying to accomplish? What are your needs? And what is the group that you're trying to support? And making sure that those programs identify with those groups. A lot of times schools will say, implement a suicide prevention program for their youth, and they never pilot tested it with their kiddos to see if it even resonates. I remember kind of similar, but a little bit different. I remember this school a few years back invested in this huge Facebook campaign, hired a graphic designer and a firm and all these things, and they put all this money into this Facebook campaign. And a couple of weeks in, they were asking, they're like, wait, this is weird. None of the kids are responding. Why aren't none of the youth participating in this huge Facebook campaign? Why isn't it working? And somebody finally asked one of the kids, and they were like, dude, we don't use Facebook anymore. What are you guys talking about? So again, always know your audience, check in with them. So that would be how I would answer that. I hope that checks out. So let's talk a little bit about positive narrative. I shared some of this earlier, but again, we have to do a better job of countering that negative narrative, that stereotype. We have to assist people and help them in being able to envision prevention. Again, we unfortunately will probably not get to a place where we're ever truly at zero, where suicide is no longer a part of our communities. But I would say that even though I've continued to be exposed to suicide in my life, I would say the majority of the stories I have related to suicide are about people deciding to live and people finding their reasons for living and people showing up and being here tomorrow. But I don't think that's the narrative. I think a lot of folks think that once you have thoughts of suicide, it's this automatic path, not realizing that for most folks, they won't move on with the suicide attempt. Most people don't know that 70% of people who make a suicide attempt will never attempt again. Most of them experience post-traumatic growth, where we just don't talk about these types of experience and the positives that come out of this. Again, we haven't normalized. We need more leaders standing up and saying, hey, yeah, I've thought about suicide and I got help and this is what I did. Not specifics about medication or therapist or anything, but yes, I was there and that's okay. It's part of for many people, a normal life experience to question whether or not we should be here tomorrow, and that's okay. So what do we know? We need to talk more about what works. We need to share more stories. We need to give people concrete actions that they can take. And we also need to do a better job of tracking data around the stuff that does work. I do a lot of work in schools. Obviously, I've used those examples a lot. Just this morning, we were doing a training on school risk screening. Tracking data on school risk screenings, that's actually a positive. That's not painting a picture of how troubled your youth are, as much as it's painting a picture of all the supports that you're giving to your youth. So there's a lot of that. What was the percentage? I think you're asking in regards to the attempts. 70% of people who attempt will not go on to ever attempt. And in fact, 90% of people who make a suicide attempt will not go on to die by suicide in their lifetime. So of people who attempt, few will repeat that attempt. Unfortunately, for those who do repeat attempts, oftentimes we've seen multiple attempts. But that still means that 10% of people who attempt will go on to die by suicide. So we need to be very vigilant in the supports we give folks after they've been through an attempt. I just want to share with you, there's not a lot of great media examples, but I thought this one was really cool. It's from Durango Herald out in Colorado. They did a multimedia, multi-story, multi-week kind of campaign related to suicide. So there was written stories, audio stories, photographs. But one of the coolest things that they did that I liked is, when you're on an online article, Yahoo or whatever, and they're talking about the latest fashion trends or whatever, you can just go in and you can comment, right? And we see a lot of vitriol and a lot of hateful things there. But especially when it comes to stories about mental health and suicide, we need to be careful. A lot of times, news media outlets will just disable comments. For one, if someone reaches out for help and they're not monitoring it. So just, fear of that. But with the Durango Herald, what was cool, you see it on the screen. So after reading or being exposed to the article, before people could just start typing away, they gave them some kind of reflective prompts. They have to identify where this article made me feel this. And what they saw was that for the most part, the comments were pretty positive, just almost forcing people to take a half second of reflection. And okay, not just I'm mad about this or I'm angry or that was dumb, but how did this make me feel? So that's just one mechanism that I thought was really interesting that I wanted to share with you all today. But there's, just kind of to recap, looking at the different aspects of the framework again, always start with the why before we get to the how. Look at your strategies. What is your goals? Who are you trying to reach? What do you want them to do? And how do you plan to get there? We spent a lot of time talking about the safety, the do's and the don'ts. I think we've spoken quite a bit about the positive narratives, how to bring those in. And then now we're going to talk about some of the guidelines that are out there in just a second. Before we get there, though, if you forget everything else we talked about today, here's kind of a quick recap. If you only do one thing when you're communicating, crafting messages, picking messages, make sure it has the resource. If possible, offer some education about warning signs, risk factors. Unless it's pertinent to the story, as best we can, try to avoid those details about methods. Code experts, you have a tremendous team up there with the Suicide Prevention Council. Lean on those folks when you need, expert opinions. And as I've said a few times, these are recommendations. They're not hard and fast rules. We ask that you just consider these, and that news media, entertainment media, consider these things as they're crafting their stories. For those of you who do any work with the media, I would encourage to remind you that news media are also members of our community. And rather than coming with our pitchforks, we're going to get a lot more with the carrot than with the stick. They also don't want suicides to happen. So rather than coming out accusatorily, look at them as teammates, very valuable teammates in our communications about suicide. As best you can, try to simplify the process. A lot of the suicide prevention councils that I've worked with in the past localize the media recommendations and also provide an expert list. So, hey, if media is looking for an interview, somebody that works with certain populations or can speak about suicide prevention in general, somebody who can speak about suicide loss and postvention. So simplifying the process. So just a couple of tips regarding media. As I mentioned, though, I want to share with you some of the guidelines we shared previously that talking about suicide in LGBT populations. Through Know the Signs, we've created a couple of toolkits, one on social media, one that's just kind of a general making headlines, how to interact and engage with news media. This one's pretty cool. I think I have a slide on it, but this one's down here is actually for entertainment media to give them some suggestions on how to craft that. And this, unfortunately, this is almost a 10-year-old quote, but it still rings true today that we need to do a better job of customizing and tailoring our messages, again, through Know the Signs and take action. We've done some work that we're proud of in making materials for diverse communities, again, that are not just translated, but culturally adapted, but we need to continue in that work. If you're not familiar, there's also a website for journalists, reportingонsuicide.org. You can go and you can download the recommendations in English or in other languages. The website continues to be updated. But one of the things that is really cool that got added recently, this is like a widget. And so if you're ever writing an article or putting out an article in a newsletter or whatever it may be, at the bottom of the reportingonsuicide.org website, you can copy and paste your article into this widget. And it's actually got algorithms in there that will review what you have written and make sure that it's in line with the recommendations about method and language and complexity and such. So just want to let you know that that's a pretty cool tool out there as well. Oh, hit that a little bit too many times. There we go. So this is what I was mentioning earlier, depictions for recommendations for depicting suicide in entertainment media. So whether it's short film or television, the news media is actually doing a significantly better job when reporting on suicide, but we need the entertainment media to now step into that space and realize they have a very powerful role. We've seen both good and bad over the last few years, but we need entertainment media to really step up to the plate. Social media as well. We need to have this conversation. A lot of folks don't realize that every social media platform has some form of mechanism for reporting posts that may have concerns about suicide. So Snapchat, Facebook, Instagram, all the snap tweets and stuff. The Lifeline actually has a page on their website and that will take you through with links to each of those. So that's just a great resource to be familiar with. Whether you're working with youth, young adults, but across the lifespan now, I think many of us are using social media in one form or another. So I want to let you know that those are there as well. Again, I always want to circle back and acknowledge that we also have the Know the Signs and Reconoce las Señales website. So suicideispreventable.org or El Suicidio is prevenible.org, where you can go to learn more about the warning signs. You can send these over to folks so they can learn about the steps to take, how to have that conversation, and what the local available resources are. If you're interested also, depending on your organization, we can also send you an embed code so that you could embed this entire website onto your current page so that people would have access to a fully interactive suicide prevention website. And excuse me, just one second. All right, I'm back. Sorry about that. Let's see. I think we're just about done. Before we close out, though, I mentioned the Directing Change program. We just recently completed our 11th year of judging. Our statewide award ceremony is going to be here in a couple of weeks. But on our website, we post all the previous year's films as well as all the winning films from this year. So if you go to directingchangeca.org at the top, you'll see a button. You click on that for films. It'll take you through all the different categories of films: mental health, suicide prevention, through the lens of culture, which not only addresses those topics across cultures, but also a lot of those are available in languages other than English. So they're available for free to download. So just want to encourage you to check those out. So anytime I do a presentation, I try to show one of those films. Right. And on that note, I think we're going to open it up for Q&A. I want to remind you of those resources again. Most important thing I asked of you was to take care of yourself. So I want to remind you that these resources are available for you as well. And on that note, I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing my screen and see what kind of questions and comments we have coming through. If you prefer to, speak your question or comment, you can always raise your hand, I think, and we can unmute you. Other than that, just want to say thank you, everybody, for being here. Hopefully you're walking away a little bit more informed and more than anything, I really hope you're walking away a lot more comfortable with messaging related to this. So also seeing some love in the chat. So thank you for that. I appreciate that. Sylvia, any questions that we've missed so far? I know you're reminding folks that we can get them the slides, that we will record this presentation. You want to share with folks. Sylvia dropped a survey in the chat, so I'm sure she's going to remind you about that here in just a second.
Yep, Stan, you read my mind. Yeah, so I'll copy paste again in the chat the demographic survey. But you all can feel free to continue thinking of your questions and comments that you may still have. But let me put that in the chat right now, the survey. And then Stan, once you're finished with your segment, I can close up, but I'll definitely give folks time if you all have questions.
So there's one question from David about mental health as it relates to euthanasia. So there are some countries that have not just for physical terminal illnesses, but for mental illnesses begun to allow that. And it is complicated. And I think even when the lines get blurred between, the choice of suicide versus end of life options, it's a really complex scenario, and I'm going to hesitate to share my opinion on this one just because it can be so combustible. But again, my hope is not that. Of course, it would be my hope that we could reduce and get rid of all suicides. I don't think that's realistic. My hope is that we do everything at every opportunity to help folks find their reasons for living and to make an informed decision. Whatever that whether it's physical pain, emotional pain, it's not my choice to force somebody that they have to stay and to be here. But I want to know that I did everything that I could do, and I want them to know that they did everything they could try to do to live a happy life. And again, that's a complicated one, so I won't get too philosophical on it. But The fact that your students are aware and having those conversations, I think, is productive. The fact that they're having those conversations with you means that there's a layer of trust there. I'm not sure at what level you're teaching. I'm guessing as a mental health clinician level or something. But there is a philosophical element to suicide. There's a soul element to suicide that I don't think that we address nearly enough. It's not just our brains all the time, right? There's something more going on. So I'll go ahead and leave it at that.
Thank you for that thoughtful response, Dan.
Lana Jean says the Know the Science campaign is really good. Thank you very much for that. Ami, thank you for the kind words. William's asking for more good examples. Yeah, I can again know this. The Know the Science campaign. We're really proud. We have a lot of materials available through that. I haven't, and of course I'm biased, but I haven't really seen a lot of other campaigns. The Know the Science campaigns received a lot of recognition across the country for the work that we've done. There's a few that are good. I have to get back to you on that though. Other than that, I'm just seeing a lot of compliments and love. So thank you everybody for all of that. I'm really glad that this meant something to you folks. Yeah, I'm not seeing any other questions, Sylvia. So I think I'm going to go ahead and kick it over to you and we can go ahead and close up. But thank you all for being here. And again, please do something to take care of yourself today.
Thank you so much, Stan. Such an honor to have you speak, and with your lived experience, with your expertise in this, and your passion and heart for this. So thank you, Stan, so much for another great webinar. We were lucky to have you last year and happy to have you back again this year.
My pleasure. Honored to be here with you all today. Thank you for those kind words.
So I'll just wrap us up a little bit. So again, the demographic link is in the chat. I also want to put in, since May is Mental Health Month, want to put in the chat Mental Health Month information in case you're interested in participating. I do want to address a question that was asked earlier about culture and mental health and barrier, trying to encourage folks of different culture to seek help. And I think that is I don't think I can also answer that easily either, but I just wanted to speak to it since we are in Mental Health Month as well. I think a big barrier for many communities is stigma, including different cultural, across different cultural communities. And one thing I've learned from the statewide efforts around stigma is one of the best ways to reduce stigma is to be in contact with someone that, you find credible, that has a story of hope and recovery. So depending on that cultural community you're thinking of, who does that community find credible? It could be different. For example, I'm Chinese American, and many folks in the Chinese community find physicians credible or doctors credible. So maybe it takes hearing from a doctor to get a referral from primary care doctor to refer to mental health as a way to encourage help. That's just an example. It doesn't apply to all people who identify as Chinese, but just something to consider. Okay, so I put in the chat the Mental Health Month information, the demographic. I will also end with some slides, and just a heads up, I will, after my segment, I'm going to stop the recording. And then Zena Andriani, my fellow co-chair here, also has an announcement to share. So let me just share the slides first, and hopefully it does full presenter mode. We'll see if this works. Oh no, it's not. Let me try. I think I can see what you all see. So let me see if I can do that again. Is that better? Do you all see full screen or? Okay, good. Great. So just some next steps. I'm going to share this handout with you all. It's been vetted by Stan. Thank you, Stan, and the Know the Science team for reviewing it and making sure it meets the guidelines. So we have two recommended next steps. One is to apply the suicide safe messaging guidelines you've learned today into your work, whether you are, you manage social media or website, or you share your lived experience story publicly, or you are a trainer for a mental health training or suicide prevention training. All these different situations, and more, you can apply the guidelines that we learned today. And 2, please share with any other partners that may not have made it today. Maybe others who work in media, entertainment, manage social media websites, are public information officers for health department, police department, fire department, or is a trainer for a mental health suicide prevention training, for example, or a crisis center volunteer or a worker. So a lot of different folks can benefit from this information. So please, we ask, if you can, please share this information, and we will share these slides, the recording, and a link to this handout as well that summarizes the guidelines for suicide safe messaging. And again, like Stan said, we really want you, most importantly, to take care of yourself first. And if needed, there are really great 24/7 resources here. If you are maybe considering suicide, or even if not, in emotional distress, there is a great great numbers here to call 24/7 if you're just wondering where to start. So there's 24/7 free confidential crisis support, and you don't necessarily need to be in a crisis to call. You can call the awesome local Star Vista Crisis Center at 650-579-0350, or you can call the national network at 988, the National Suicide and Crisis. I'm going to get the name mixed. I think it's Crisis and Suicide Lifeline. And you can also text BAY 741 to 741-741, or you can text 988. And you can visit this website, sanmatelcrisis.org, for teen crisis services and services for across ages as well. And for emergencies that need an immediate response, call or text 911. And there's more guidelines and resources on the website if you want more guidelines on what to do in a mental health emergency when you call 911. And I'm gonna go to the next slide. Yeah, so that's everything we have today. I want to really thank Stan again for presenting, being our guest presenter. We hope you come back next year. And thank you to Stan is also part of the Know the Science team. So really thank you to your team as well. And to Star Vista Crisis Center for being our go-to resource, and also Zena for co-chairing this work with me. And acknowledging my other colleagues behind the scenes at the San Mateo County Behavioral Health and Recovery Services Office of Diversity and Equity. Before I end, Zena, did you want to say anything about this training before we talk about your announcement?
Nothing to add, just thank you so much for being here, Stan. I know it's really valuable for all of us here, and I always just learn so much. So thank you on behalf of everyone.
Oh, it's very sweet. Thank you. It's an honor to be with y'all. I'll come back anytime.
Thank you, Stan. We have you recorded for that.
All right.
Just kidding. Just kidding. We won't ask too much, but really appreciate you, Stan, and appreciate the audience for being so engaging. So thank you all. I'm going to stop the recording, but if there are any comments or questions, please feel free to continue to come through. We went through this training a lot more quickly than I expected. So at least me and Zena can stay on. So let me stop the recording. Thank you all again.